There's a conversation happening right now that most people in public life have decided not to touch. Not because it lacks evidence, not because it lacks consequence, but because the moment someone raises it, the labels come quickly, the dismissals follow, and the conversation dies before it even begins. What we are going to talk about today has been building for years, quietly, in comment sections and dinner tables, in therapy offices and group chats, and locker rooms that nobody films. It lives in the silence of men who have learned that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. It lives in the frustration of people who feel that something has shifted but cannot name it without being misread. Today, we name it. Today, we follow where the evidence actually leads, because what began as a necessary cultural correction has, in certain spaces, crossed a line, and the reaction to that crossing is now reshaping conversations we cannot afford to keep ignoring. Think about how we actually got here. A few decades ago, the cultural conversation around gender began, rightly, to expand. Women's voices entered spaces they had long been shut out of. Real conversations about power, about abuse, about structural imbalance became not just possible, but necessary. These were not abstract ideological debates. They were responses to real harm, and the world, in many measurable ways, became better for them. But movements, when they gather real momentum, do not always stop exactly where they should. They overshoot. They develop their own internal cultures, their own language, their own sense of what is and is not allowed, and somewhere along the way, in the corners of social media, in the tone of certain TV shows, in the casual language of podcasts and comment threads, something that started as criticism of harmful behaviors began to drift, slowly, incrementally, almost imperceptibly. It drifted from critique into something that started to sound more like contempt, not for what men did, but for what men are. That drift did not happen overnight. It rarely does, but it happened. And now something else is happening in response. The question worth asking is not whether this reaction exists. It clearly does. The question is where it leads. And that is exactly what we are here to examine. Let me tell you about someone. Call him Daniel. He is 23 years old. He grew up online, which means he grew up inside a particular kind of ecosystem, one shaped as much by algorithms as by the people physically around him. He's not unusual. He is, in many ways, exactly representative of a generation. Daniel did not experience one single dramatic moment of rejection or ridicule. His experience was quieter than that, and in some ways, harder to articulate because of it. What he encountered was accumulation. A meme here, a trending post there, a video where the punchline, always, was some version of the same thing. Men are the problem. Men are the joke. Men need to do better. Sit down. Listen more. Speak less. Some of those messages carried real substance. Many of them did. But what Daniel noticed, over time, was not any single message. It was the pattern. It was the way the laughter felt pointed. It was the way certain generalizations, the kind that would be immediately challenged if they were aimed at almost any other group, floated through his feeds completely unchallenged, collected thousands of approving reactions, and dissolved into the next news cycle as though nothing worth questioning had occurred. He tried once to raise this in a group chat with friends. He was told he was being sensitive. He tried again in a college seminar. He was told he was centering himself in a conversation that was not about him. And so Daniel did what many young men in his position have done. He stopped raising it. He kept the discomfort to himself. He carried it into a silence that grew a little heavier every week. This is not a story about victimhood. It is a story about what happens when real feelings find no real outlet. And that story ends in very different places depending on where the pressure eventually goes. Now think about the language itself, the memes, the captions, the throwaway lines in sitcoms, the social media bio that gets 12,000 likes for saying something about men that, if you simply swap the group, would never make it through moderation. There is a genuine difference between a joke and a pattern. a single satirical observation about male behavior, about emotional unavailability, about entitlement, about the blind spots that culture can produce, that can be incisive. It can open something rather than close it. But when the same structure repeats itself every single day across dozens of platforms, accumulating into a kind of background noise, men are lazy, men are fragile, men are threats, men are jokes, something changes in how that language functions. It stops being critique. It starts being atmosphere, and atmosphere shapes what we expect, and what we expect shapes what we see. When someone has absorbed thousands of iterations of the same negative framing about a group, their interpretive default quietly shifts. They begin to see the stereotype confirmed before they have even finished looking for exceptions. The exceptions get dismissed as anomalies. The pattern gets reinforced not by new evidence, but by the sheer accumulated weight of repetition. This is not unique to conversations about men. This is how stereotyping works. In every direction it has ever moved. The mechanism does not change based on which group is the subject. What begins as irony sometimes evolves into expectation. And expectation, held long enough without challenge, begins to function like truth. The problem gets worse when legitimate criticism disappears into generalization. There is a version of accountability that actually makes things better. It names specific behaviors. It identifies real patterns of harm. It holds individuals and institutions responsible for choices they actually made. That kind of criticism is difficult and necessary. And when it is done well, it genuinely changes things. But it requires something. It requires precision. It requires the ability to say, this action caused harm, without also saying, everyone who shares a characteristic with this person is therefore equally suspect. That precision is extremely hard to maintain online. Platforms reward urgency, not nuance. Algorithms amplify outrage because outrage generates clicks. And so, a conversation that starts with one specific critique of a specific person, a specific behavior, goes through a process of successive abstraction until the specific completely disappears. And what remains is just a category. Men. Men do this. Men are like this. Men cannot be trusted to understand this. Binary thinking is not something the internet invented, but the internet has given it a reach and a velocity that earlier generations simply did not have to contend with. A generalization that might once have stayed contained within one community, one publication, now travels globally within hours, arriving pre-validated by thousands of approvals it collected on the way. By the time it reaches the next person, it already carries the social weight of consensus, and questioning it feels like swimming against a current that everyone else seems perfectly happy to ride. Now let us look at the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that the conversation has been slow to acknowledge. Studies tracking male loneliness across Western countries have shown consistent increases over the past 2 decades. A striking portion of men, particularly young men, report having no close friends, no one they would actually call in a genuine crisis. This is not a small statistical fluctuation. It is a structural shift in how a large portion of the male population experiences human connection. And it is not stabilizing, it is accelerating. Mental health data follows a parallel path. Rates of depression among young men have climbed steadily. Suicide rates among men remain disproportionately high across most age groups, a disparity that has persisted for decades while receiving a fraction of the public attention devoted to other health crises of comparable scale. Rates of addiction skew higher among men. Rates of homelessness skew heavily male. And then there is education. Boys falling behind in school. Young men withdrawing from higher education in numbers that have become measurable and consistent across multiple countries simultaneously. These are not numbers that belong to any single political argument. They are not evidence for one ideology or against another. They are real indicators of real human suffering, distributed across real human lives. And they sit in uncomfortable proximity to a question that the broader conversation has been reluctant to ask: whether the cultural environment around men, in certain ways, in certain registers, has contributed to a world where these struggles feel unspeakable, where asking for help feels like confirming a weakness that the culture has already decided to mock. Here is the mechanism that makes this harder to solve than it first appears. When negative messaging about a group, about their worth, their character, their fundamental trustworthiness, is sustained long enough and delivered through enough channels that feel normal, the people receiving it do not simply absorb it and move on. They respond, and the response takes different shapes depending on the person. Some men turned inward. They became quieter, more cautious about where they spoke and what they revealed. They developed a kind of constant social self-monitoring, exhausting to maintain and corrosive to real connection over time. This withdrawal does not announce itself. It accumulates slowly in fewer friendships, less openness, a growing quiet sense that the cost of being seen as a man in certain spaces is simply higher than the benefit of showing up. Others responded with something else, a resentment that did not necessarily express itself loudly, but built in the space between what they actually felt and what they believed they were allowed to say. This kind of resentment begins somewhere recognizable. It begins as the feeling of being misrepresented, of being treated as a category rather than a person. Most human beings have felt some version of that at some point. What matters is what happens to it next. Because here is the part that demands the most honest attention. Ignoring emotions does not erase them. Pressure without release finds another path. When legitimate frustration has no legitimate outlet, it does not simply disappear. It migrates. And there are communities, online and off, that have become very skilled at finding men in exactly that state and offering them somewhere to go. Not somewhere healthy, not somewhere constructive, but somewhere that offers the considerable appeal of finally feeling understood. The pipeline from legitimate grievance to something much darker is not inevitable, but it is real, and it is fed in part by the failure to create space for the grievance before it has time to harden into something else. There is a specific kind of psychological weight to a silence that is enforced not by law or explicit threat, but by social consequence. Men who spoke openly about feeling dismissed did not, in most cases, face any legal sanction. What they faced was social cost, the rolled eyes, the reframing of their concern as bad faith, the implication that noticing their own experience was itself a form of privilege they should be too aware to exercise. This produces a specific internal conflict that is difficult to articulate and easy to dismiss from the outside. A man who feels that something is unfair, but has absorbed from the surrounding culture the message that men cannot legitimately claim unfairness, does not simply resolve that conflict cleanly. He holds it. He carries it alongside his other responsibilities, alongside his relationships and his work and his daily performance of having everything under control. He does not talk about it, and the not talking becomes its own weight, layered on top of everything else. Fear of ridicule is a powerful shaper of behavior, not because ridicule is the worst thing a person can experience, but because it strikes at something specific, the sense of being taken seriously, of being treated as someone whose experience actually counts. When men learned, through accumulated social feedback, that expressing vulnerability in certain ways would be met with dismissal or contempt, they adapted. They built a public-facing version of themselves that handled things privately and told everyone it was fine. This adaptation is very good at maintaining surfaces. It is very bad at creating the conditions for anything like genuine wellness. And then something started changing. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but unmistakably. The pushback that had lived quietly in private conversations, in small forums, in the observations of people who noticed but lacked an audience, began finding larger expression. Writers who had been cautious about touching these topics started writing about them. Researchers who had been studying male mental health in relative obscurity started receiving real public attention. Podcasts and channels built around the specific question of what it means to be a young man in this cultural moment began growing audiences that surprised even their creators. The conversation that had been excluded from mainstream discourse did not stay excluded. It expanded, and as it expanded, it became impossible to characterize simply. It was not, as some suggested, purely a reactionary movement. It was not, as others suggested, purely a crisis of bruised ego. It was a collection of voices that did not share the same conclusions, but did share a common starting point, the sense that something had gone wrong, that the conversation had overreached, and that it was past time to say so honestly. Public discussions emerged in places where they had previously been unwelcome. Debates that had felt closed began reopening, not because the original arguments were wrong, but because new evidence and new consequences were making the simple version harder to sustain. The reaction was here, and it was not going to be reversed by pretending otherwise. Now here is something important. Not all of these reactions lead to the same place, and that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Some of the response took genuinely constructive forms. Organizations focused on male mental health began receiving more support and more mainstream legitimacy. Conversations about making therapy less stigmatized for men, about why men avoid seeking help, and what might actually change that, gained real traction. Educators began asking serious questions about how school environments were or were not serving boys, and what evidence-based changes might make a measurable difference. These responses did not require abandoning support for women. They did not require denying structural inequalities that genuinely still exist. They simply made one argument that addressing problems for one group does not require ignoring problems in another. Stated plainly, that is an obvious position, but it had somehow become controversial. The constructive response argued that it should not be. Other reactions were more defensive: withdrawal from mixed spaces, a generalized cynicism about the possibility of honest dialogue, a sense that the culture had become so hostile that disengagement was the only rational response. From relationships, from institutions, from the broader social contract that requires at least some mutual good faith to function. These responses were understandable. They were not useful. They deepened isolation rather than addressing what caused it. They offered the feeling of self-protection while quietly removing the conditions for genuine connection. And then there were the extreme reactions, the ones that received the most media coverage precisely because they were the most dramatic: identity-driven anger, communities built around shared contempt rather than shared aspiration, the transformation of legitimate frustration into an ideology of resentment that ultimately served no one, including the men who adopted it. These reactions were real, and their harms were real, but treating them as representative of every man who felt dismissed was itself a failure of exactly the nuance the broader conversation had been missing from the start. The difference between these three currents is not a minor detail. It is the whole point. There is a moral dimension here that deserves to be named directly. Supporting one group has never, in any genuine ethical framework, required diminishing another. The original moral argument for greater equality, that all people deserve to be treated as fully human, to have their suffering acknowledged, to participate in conversations that shape their own lives, does not have a natural stopping point that excludes men. The argument for equality is either universal, or it is not really an argument for equality. It is something else. The history of social movements includes many moments where a genuine impulse toward liberation, encountering the inevitable frustrations and human costs of change, began producing its own versions of the very dehumanization it originally opposed. Not always, not inevitably, but enough that we should be capable of recognizing the pattern when we see it recurring. Contempt for men or for anyone else as a category is not justice. It does not produce the conditions for justice. It produces backlash. It produces entrenchment. It hardens divisions that might otherwise have remained negotiable. Justice requires the ability to distinguish between a harmful behavior and the full humanity of the person who performed it. That distinction is not a nicety. It is the difference between accountability and punishment, between social correction and something that starts to look more like social war. Tone matters, language matters. The way we speak about any group, including men, shapes how we think about them, how we treat them, and how they come to understand their own place in the world. Thoughtful societies ask themselves, periodically, whether their language is still serving the values they claim to hold. This is one of those moments. Healthy accountability does not require villains, it requires honesty. And honesty looks different from condemnation even when it addresses the same behaviors. The conversations that have actually changed things around male behavior or anything else have been the ones that distinguish between the person and the pattern, that offer a direction forward rather than simply a wall, and that treat the people being asked to change as genuinely capable of changing. This sounds simple. In practice, it means resisting some of the strongest incentives that modern communication creates. It means accepting that slow, honest transformation does not generate the same engagement as spectacular confrontation. It means doing the quieter, less rewarded work of building conditions for real dialogue rather than just performing the appearance of it. Mutual responsibility means something specific here. It means that those with legitimate criticisms bear some responsibility for how those criticisms are delivered, not because the feelings of the criticized should override the facts, but because how something lands determines whether it produces change or just produces resistance. It means that those who feel unfairly characterized bear some responsibility for engaging with what is genuinely being said rather than retreating entirely into defensiveness. And it means that platforms, media institutions, and the cultural voices that shape these conversations bear responsibility for the incentive structures they have built and for what those structures have made possible and what they have made impossible. Collective blame is not accountability. It is the abandonment of accountability dressed up to feel righteous. What actually changes things is specific, honest conversation about specific behaviors and specific consequences, the kind that treats every person in the room as a moral agent capable of doing better. We return, at the end, to where we started. How did we get here? And where does here lead? We got here through a combination of genuine progress and real overcorrection, through institutional cowardice and algorithmic amplification, and through the very human tendency to stop questioning a thing once it starts to feel like it is already on the right side of history. We got here because important conversations, when they go unexamined long enough, accumulate distortions, and because silence, in all its forms, from all directions, is never actually neutral. It is always doing something. It is always shaping what comes next. Where this leads depends on choices that are still being made. A society that allows legitimate frustration to go unaddressed long enough will eventually encounter that frustration in forms far more difficult to engage with. A culture that decides one group's pain is more speakable than another's does not make the unspoken pain disappear. It stores it with interest. The reaction that has been building is not going to be wished away. It will find expression. The only remaining question is what kind of expression that will be, whether it moves toward dialogue or deeper into entrenchment, toward something more complex, or toward the dangerous simplicity of blame. What is achievable, perhaps the only thing that is achievable right now, is the willingness to listen before concluding, to hold the discomfort of a complicated picture rather than retreating to the comfort of an easy one, to distinguish between critique and contempt, and to remember that the goal was never to decide which group gets to be human. The goal was to build a world where everyone is, because when conversations become impossible, frustration grows in silence. But when people finally begin speaking honestly again, even the uncomfortable truths can become the beginning of something better.